Hello and welcome to the Leaders Council podcast, the podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. You join us in yet another sunny day here in the capital. I'm Matthew O'Neill, and today, as always, we ensure that we have a variety of distinct perspectives on leadership. First, we're joined by Rob Chester, UK Managing Director of NSF, a global independent organization that protects human health by developing public health and safety standards and providing certification and testing services. Mr. Chester has had a glittering career which has seen him hold leadership positions in some of the world's most recognizable red-letter companies. Currently, Rob Chester oversees over 300 employees and 300 further contractors. And in 2018, under Mr. Chester's leadership, NSF earned the accolade of Company of the Year at the Society of Food and Hygiene and Technology Awards. And now let's hear from the man himself. Rob, hello.
Hello, Matthew.
Well, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you again. A lot has changed since the last time we spoke at the beginning of this pandemic. Can you bring our listeners up to date as to where NSF is now?
Yeah, as you say, it feels like the world is changing faster right now than probably it has for any time in history. Yeah, my business is doing pretty well. We're recovering broadly at the same speed as our customers, and we're quite lucky in that we have quite a diverse business in the UK. So we do a variety of things in a variety of different sectors, and we're very lucky actually that some of those sectors of the economy have continued pretty well through COVID. So we've still got a very varied situation, is how I'd describe it. That there are some parts of the business that are performing really well, and there's others that are still struggling because the customers that we serve in those sectors are still struggling too. So yeah, it's still a very evolving picture, is how I'd describe it right now.
As we prepare to begin to slowly exit lockdown, how do you see your company's role within the new post-COVID reality as someone who sits within the health and safety field?
To make us as indispensable to our customers as possible. As I'm fortunate in I do quite a lot of mentoring and discussions with lots of other business leaders, and they constantly remind me how lucky we are to be in the public health sector right now, and how lucky I am compared to some of their businesses in the sectors where they're operating. And that's true. You know, a lot of our customers do need us right now, and hopefully new customers will need us, because it's a very dynamic situation. Is COVID? It's changing all the time, and if there's one thing people look a lot for, isn't it? They want certainty. They just want to know what they've got to do in situations like this. And unfortunately, because of COVID and because it's a very evolving situation, that certainty is quite hard to come by. So my byword at the moment really is to try and make ourselves as essential to our customers as possible, because we can help them in with the complexity they're having to deal with. If we can make ourselves indispensable to how they're trying to deal with that and bring some clarity to the situation, then hopefully we can make ourselves indispensable as they try and cope with what this new normal is going to look like, which is very varied in different sectors,
Now, I understand that NSF has initiated a new initiative called Checked by NSF program to help businesses reopen. Maybe you could let our listeners in on that.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental basis, it actually was a customer that said to me the concept that guidelines are not enough. If there's one thing that the governments around the world are doing right now is these copious amounts of guidelines that get sent out to businesses and to sectors. There you go, that's how you do things. The analogy this customer used was that's like giving someone the highway code and expecting them to be able to drive a car. It usually doesn't work out too well, because ultimately, of course, guidelines have got to be operationalized. You have to take them and turn them into understandable things. that people can implement in a business and run it as well as they can. And we're fortunate at NSF that we have a huge variety of customers, from the very biggest through to the very smallest. And even some of our biggest clients and customers have really struggled with this concept of being able to operationalize these new changes on the ground. And that's basically what Check by NSF is all about. For those that want a bit of a framework, it's a great framework for them to try and operationalize the stuff that they're trying to get going in their organization, to get people to understand the new processes, the new rules, the new approach. But for those that want a bespoke offer, we're happy to help them too, because we do, as I say, we help businesses that have got big in-house compliance teams, lots of expertise, lots of knowledge, and we help the very smallest guys that have got very little of that. So yeah, our approach is to try and tailor it. But if I was to sum it up in one word, it's just that concept that basically guidelines are not enough. You've got to be able to operationalize this in your business and teach people, train people on new habits really quite quickly. Which, as we all know from our New Year's resolutions every year, we all know how hard it is to stick to new things that we've got to change behavior with.
Now, if any of the listeners would like to take advantage of this new program, how would they go about that?
You can find us through our website, nsfinternationalfood.co.uk. Or frankly, I'm quite easy to find, so you can stick me into LinkedIn, and I've answered quite a lot of customers that have come to me through social media or followed me on Twitter. Although I can't remember my Twitter name. That's not good, is it, for an interview like this? But there we go. You live and learn. But yes, no, you can find me pretty easily just through Googling me, Rob Chester NSF, and you'll find us. And like I say, we're proud to help the very biggest businesses through to the very smallest.
Fantastic. Well, let's talk a bit about those guidelines coming from central governments around the world. There are a lot of them, as we've mentioned. What do you think of the effectiveness of them? Do you think a lot of them are a lot of smoke to make it seem as if they are achieving something? Or do you think that just the sheer volume of guidelines coming out is causing the populace to become more confused and more complacent than they would be if they were just clear, straightforward guidelines?
Yeah, no, I've got a lot of sympathy with the government position. I really do. Governments of all countries and all persuasions, I really do, because it is a very difficult situation to handle. The concept that we had in the UK of getting everybody to stay at home through the first phase of COVID was a lovely, simple message. Always very easy. Everybody could grasp it, couldn't they? Those lovely 3-line words that they were coming up with: stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It's really simple and really easy. And obviously, when a government moves away from that to a more nuanced approach, that's when you're always going to get into much more difficulty with those pesky journalists that then get onto the minutiae of these different areas, and where it really doesn't make a lot of sense to people as the situation changes. You've only got to look at the thing around face masks being the obvious example right now, where as we speak tomorrow, that's when they're going to become compulsory in shops. They haven't been compulsory in shops up until now. So trying to explain that to the public and to businesses, that's a really hard challenge, and I don't envy them in terms of dealing with all of that. For our clients, what we try and do is try and describe why the journey is changing, and therefore try and make it a little simpler to understand why these different guidelines are moving in different directions. And let me just give you one example from a customer discussion I was having this morning. This is a customer that runs a restaurant. And basically their question to me was, look, Rob, I've looked at the guidance for gyms, and that's much, much easier to follow and use and rule. So why can't I use that in restaurants? I've got my customers who go to a gym, they come to a restaurant. There's different rules there. They're easier to follow and use. I'd just rather use those. And of course, in simple terms, that can make a lot of sense. But obviously, the approach the government here is taking is that some sectors of the economy are inherently risky, inherently more difficult to control and manage safely than others. And gyms is obviously one of those things which the government has left till later in their plan because they understand it is not as easy to operate those premises as safely as other premises. And therefore they come up obviously with more risk-based approaches to what they do in those sectors. So yes, I think it's in many cases it is a confusing and it is an evolving picture. And I think it's one where you have to force your brain to adopt a growth mindset that says, look, these situations are going to change, they're going to develop, they're going to move. Those people that are looking for one-time certainty that never changes, I'm afraid are going to be sadly disappointed because unfortunately COVID is not that type of situation. It's evolving.
Do you think that the point scoring that the journalists have been engaged in with the government has been detrimental to the public being able to adopt these regulations that are coming out? There's been a lot of point scoring. Is that just making it much more difficult for people?
I think on occasions, yes. I think that's true. I think that the thing with the wonderful journalists is that journalists love simplicity, don't they? They always reach for easy answers. And unfortunately, this is not a situation that lends itself well to easy answers. As my father used to say to me, that for every complex problem, Rob, there's an easy answer. The trouble is, it's wrong. And that, I think, sums up the situation in many ways. That, of course, there are some things that really do not make a lot of sense. But it's very difficult when you want to try and take a risk-based approach to situations to come up with a thoroughly consistent approach that will apply in all circumstances and across all sectors. So yeah, I do think journalists have got an obligation to try and do their best to help the public to understand this. But at the same time, they also have a really important job of speaking truth to power and holding the powers that be responsible for the decisions they make. So they play many roles, don't they, journalists?
Absolutely.
And I think, therefore, it's also a tough time for those guys in terms of how they're handling this.
Well, while we are in the sort of tricky neck of the woods, do you think that devolution has been a blessing or a hindrance to our efforts to contain COVID?
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly been a hindrance, other than I think it has led to this overall view of complexity. That when we've, for the exact same scenario, ended up with different statuses in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, all at the same time, it's pretty hard to explain to people why that would happen. And therefore, I think I'm personally, I'm a big fan of making decision making as local as you possibly can. In principle, I'm a fan of that, and I think that the closer power is to people locally, the more they're going to feel it's relevant for them. But at the same time, obviously, we are kingdom, and therefore we have people that are travelling from England to Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and they're having to deal with different rules as they do that. No one's going to argue that that's going to be simple for people to understand. So I think it is a paradox, isn't it, that people want as much simplicity around this situation as they can. But at the same time, there's a lot of fans of devolution who think it's absolutely right that local governments in those areas are making decisions.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's a very good question because it's a very difficult paradox, and I don't think there's one straightforward easy answer
Now, I don't know about your feelings on this, but a lot of people have felt that particularly the SNP's approach to the COVID-19 outbreak has amounted to quite a bit of point scoring against Westminster. Do you feel that their undercutting of England's stance on the coronavirus protection measures have decreased the public's trust in the measures taken here within England?
I don't think so. I do think Scotland has had certainly the numbers and the figures in Scotland on coronavirus do seem to indicate that the handling of the crisis in Scotland has been good. They've still had the challenges around care homes, haven't they, where they've got a similar situation to the other devolved nations. But I don't think that's necessarily been. What I would say again is that I have a lot of sympathy with those customers that we service today, for example, where we have customers that have sites in England and have sites in Wales and sites in Scotland, where they've got to deal with these different situations on the ground and have colleagues in their facilities understanding these different situations on the ground. That's where I've got a lot of sympathy, and where those people are thirsting, I think, really for a simpler approach. But no, I wouldn't accuse them of I wouldn't accuse them of being disingenuous as to what they've tried to do.
How has the pandemic changed the way that public health is protected? Will we see an expanded role for organizations such as yours in the future?
Yes, I think it's going to change quite I think COVID has shown quite a lot of business rules that people have maybe used in the past have been shown to be a little naive in a world of COVID. I, for example, through my career, have been a big fan of lean. How supply chains have all been lean over the last 15, 20 years, following, the Toyota approach from Japan, et cetera. And a lot of those decisions around, for example, things like it doesn't matter where in the world your suppliers are. Don't holding stock. That's a bad idea. That's dead money. Don't do that. Use just-in-time deliveries. And a lot of those principles on which many business leaders have run their business for the last few years now look really questionable, don't they? In the light of COVID, they look like they were taken at a very different time. And I think there are aspects, yes, of things like risk management, health. I think everybody's seen COVID as one of those things that may appear on a risk map to be having a huge impact if they came, but the likelihood of them occurring was always relatively low. And I think everybody's getting a reminder right now that when they do occur, the amount of financial exposure and risk that's created in the world is quite enormous. And therefore, I think, for things like public health, for things like even things like business continuity expertise, which has been quite niche in the business world. There are some of our customers who do have extensive business continuity of what happens if this risk happens or that risk happens. But it's always been seen as quite a niche area. I think a lot of those niche areas are now going to come far more into the field and into the purview of running an everyday business, because I think everybody's just had a really good reminder of what the heck happens when these really high impact events that may have a low likelihood, but if they come along, have a disruptive nature. So yes, I do think things like public health will be taken a lot more seriously, I think, in the future. I do. I think what's the old adage of never waste a good crisis. And I do therefore think a lot of businesses have had a real reminder as to why a lot of these things are really important.
What would you say would be the sort of practices that companies should put into place now to maximize their effectiveness in the post-COVID world?
Oh, I think that's about building trust. The customers that I've talked to recently about this area, I've been advising all of them to try and take a long-term view about building trust with their customers and with their employees. I think that's vital. If you're going to take a long-term view of business, you're going to be a business that wants to be around in 10, 15, 20 years. Don't take short-term decisions. Take longer-term decisions. And around creating trust, I have 4 things that I personally use that are sort of staple to my desk as to how you do that. I think the first thing is you have to behave predictably and consistently. You really want to have customers having, for example, a consistent experience when they come to your facilities. You don't want them one time to come in and have a temperature taken, and then come the following day and, oh no, we're not doing that anymore. And then the following day, yes, we're back on. They're not going to think that you're treating it properly. So firstly, behave predictably and consistently. Secondly, communicate as clearly as you possibly can. The customers want to know what to expect when they turn up. So please do the best you can to communicate as clearly and as simply what your controls are, what steps you're taking, what measures you're taking. Thirdly, treat promises really seriously. So if you promise you're going to do something, if you're going to give a guarantee to a customer that this is how we're going to operate, or this is what we do, please take that really seriously and follow through on those and always make sure you're going to do it. Because promises matter in times like the one we're facing right now. And finally, be as forthright and as candid as you possibly can. I think a lot of business leaders in tough times can think they're doing people a favor by not necessarily being as candid and as upfront as they maybe need to be. But one of my golden rules is try not. Yes, you give hope. You want to give hope to your colleagues and your customers about the future and where you're going as a business, but you don't want to do that in a false way. You don't want to give false hope. So yeah, I think it's all about creating trust. If you can do a good job of creating trust, you are likely to have a better long-term future than those that don't.
Now, before we finish our interview today, I'd like to pivot away from the pandemic for a moment, if I may, and touch on your experience from one of your past lives, as it were. For a good amount of time, you lived and worked in China. With all the shifts in the world stage at the moment, China's relationship with Hong Kong and the West, the COVID situation, and so on and so forth, what sort of effect do you think this will have on our future relationship with China, and what does this mean for the average Chinese man on the street?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's changed remarkably since I lived in China. I left China in 2014. I've lived there very proudly and very happily for 3 years. An amazing experience, and I still mentor a large group of Chinese people. So I speak to them frequently about the situation and about what's happening. I think it's changed a lot actually since I left in 2014. At that stage, I thought President Xi was taking a more cautious approach as to how he was developing China's footprint. And certainly my view is, since I left, is that that's changed a lot. I think the Hong Kong example would probably be the one that to me appears like China has taken a much more aggressive approach dealing with Hong Kong than I would have ever predicted back when I was there in 2014. I think it's changed a lot. And I do think at the moment see the UK government coming under increasing pressure because of that to take a harder line with China. And so, yes, I do think it is going to make relationships, business. I think it will make things tougher. And like I say, I have real mixed views about that because I live there very happily and I have a tremendous soft spot for the Chinese people. And I guess when I'm answering questions like this, I do try and differentiate between the Chinese people where I have nothing but joy and love for my old Chinese team. I still have their picture next to me on my desk of the team that I built there, versus the Chinese leadership government system. Obviously, the two are intertwined, but I do try and think of them quite separately because my experience with the people of China was categorically not what I expected. I went there thinking I was going to be entering a very dour communist country, etc., etc. And I found that the sense of humour of the Chinese people was just amazing when you live in and working with them every day. So yeah, I do think it's going to be a real period of change with China where it's going to be, I think, a lot more fracture between countries that take a harder line with China. I think you're seeing that already with Australia, with some of the decisions they've taken and the impact that's having now on Australian trade. And so, yes, I do think it's going to be a period where relations are going to be more strained.
Mm-hmm. And just putting aside for a moment the obvious concerns over human rights and religious freedoms and so on and so forth within mainland China, if we talk a bit about Hong Kong as a financial entity, as the Chinese Communist Party increases their control over the city-state, how do you think the financial health of Hong Kong will develop?
I think it'll change to have a much more mainland Chinese approach. One of my business associates runs one of the major luxury hotels in Hong Kong, and I actually visited back in December last year. Was my last trip there, and I had dinner with him while I was there. And one of the things he told me was that when I used to live in one of his hotels, that the client base in that hotel when I was there 4 or 5 years ago was 80% Western, 20% mainland Chinese. And he said that in less than 5 years that has switched. So it's now 80% mainland Chinese, 20% Western. And I think that tells you how the business district and banking sector and other financial is going to pivot in China. I think it will pivot away from a large predominance of Western brands and maybe local Hong Kong brands to being far more mainland Chinese. And as that happens, obviously there'll be some people that will not be for, and therefore a lot of people will probably seek to maybe move on in their lives and sadly leave Hong Kong. But I think that's sort of inevitable on the way that China is running it right now. There's going to be businesses from the mainland that are really happy to continue to operate in Hong Kong and will work successfully with that. And I think there are going to be others where it's going to be far more challenging. So yeah, I do think it's going to change the outlook and change the brands that are thriving within Hong Kong. I think yes.
Now, before we finish, and as we lay the very complex issue of Hong Kong in China to one side, do you have any final thoughts on UK PLC as we ramp up to the final date for the end of the Brexit transition period?
Yeah, I think it's another area, isn't it, where most businesses are really, really craving certainty. I was listening to a gentleman from the Food and Drink Federation, Ian Wright. I was listening to one of his podcasts this weekend, and he was really highlighting this, that there are sectors of the economy right now that are craving absolute clarity as to what's going to happen come December this year and January next year. And I think there are some sectors where clarity is now high and they know where they're going and they feel a lot more comfortable and controlled about it. And I think there are others where they are still desperate to know what that clearer picture is going to look like. So yes, I think it's another area where, at a time when there's already so much business uncertainty, people are craving to know what the rules are and how they're going to be applied and what it's going to mean for them. Because of course, once the furlough scheme stops from the government in October this year, the rubber's really going to hit the road for business. Who are going to have to make them tough decisions about whether they try and continue and carry on with their current colleagues or they do changes. So anything that makes that even more uncertain, I'm sure for many businesses is going to be very unwelcome.
Well, Rob, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us on the podcast. And as always, you're always welcome back. But for now, Rob, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
That was Rob Chester, UK Managing Director of NSF. And now, if you haven't heard it before, is my exclusive interview with our chairman, Lord Blunkett. Lord Blunkett, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you.
Well, of course, nothing is being said at the moment other than COVID-19, which we must touch on. What would your message be to small businesses who are trying to keep going?
Well, I think the last ones standing will be the ones that thrive when we get back to some sort of normality. So it's have confidence and courage. Obviously, take advantage as far as you can of the government help. I think that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has gone about as far as you could have expected. Mm-hmm. In the circumstances. There are obviously small businesses that fall between the cracks. Those who don't have defined premises can't benefit from the business rate waiver, have not really been able to demonstrate that they can adhere to the PAYE for furloughing staff, and of course whether they can receive the grant, 10,000 or 25,000. All of those who can are obviously able at least to benefit from that for the time being and look to the future. But I think the second thing to say, and they don't need me to tell them this as a politician who did once do a business studies qualification, which is that it will be a different world, and being able to think about how that world will look in a year's time and be creative about it and learn from not just what's happening to you at this moment in time, but to others around you and the sector that you're working in, that will be really important.
Do you feel that the long-term effects of the COVID-19 outbreak will in some ways be positive for British industry?
Well, only in the sense that people are having to be creative, they're having to adjust and innovate. Therefore, they're thinking about more productive, if you like, greater productivity ways of delivering the same service or delivering the same products. And in that sense, I think we'll have temporarily at least very much higher unemployment than we've become used to, but we'll probably have a burst of productivity, which will help with the recovery. Whether it will help with the inequity of the way in which our economy is imbalanced, both between services and productivity and the production of goods and services, I'm not sure. What we will need to try and do is to ensure that the geographic imbalance that exists is, as far as humanly possible, is dealt with by both the entrepreneurship and innovation from the bottom up and targeted government help, which will still be needed. And we are now in the throes of the kind of borrowing that we saw back in 2008 to save the banking and economic system. We're having to do that to save the whole of our productive business and commerce, and I think that will have to be sustained for some time.
Do you feel that people will take a second look at global supply chains in the wake of this outbreak?
I think there's going to be much more creative ways of using local supply and linking up inside sectors much more effectively, and I hope that the Leaders' Council will be able to play a part in that, in the sense that people who have something in common, a synergy in terms of what they're delivering, whether it's a service or whether it's manufacturing or whatever, will be able to see that there's a good outcome from knowing the sector better, linking with people, not just geographically, locally, but those in this country who may not have been on the radar in terms of what they produced for the supply chain. And of course, ensuring, because there's quite a lot of fraud going on as we speak with people getting into cyber attacks, that they'll also take account of going into the cybersecurity side effectively as well. The more we are online, the more people who are working from home, the more vulnerable those businesses and their supply chain become. And that's something to think about as well.
How important is strong leadership at the moment?
Well, I actually think that it's brought to the fore leadership in a whole range of areas, from obviously government itself, and there's been ups and downs with the Prime Minister's severe illness, but all the way through the public and private sector. People have, to use the jargon, stepped up, and they've shown local, regional, national level the kind of leadership that Britain historically was very good at. Regrettably, we've not seen the same on the international scene for all kinds of reasons, but maybe we will in future. So I think out of this will come experience of people who have seen an opportunity to do good, as well as seen an opportunity to provide a good service or goods, including, for instance, shortages for the health and social care system, the food chain and the like, but also I think in terms of seeing the synergy between the private and the voluntary sector and using people's commitment to each other in a very positive way. I'm not sentimental about this. Things will revert. But actually, I think there's a kind of moment of moral judgment of people feeling that they've got a role to play outside the immediate survival that they're engaged in. And if we can hang on to a little bit of that social responsibility, that will be a very positive outcome.
Absolutely. Now, what's your broad view of how the government is responding to this? Are you broadly supportive of their measures?
Well, it may surprise people to hear that I have been very supportive. Of course, there's been legitimate criticisms about the speed of response on protective equipment and on issues relating to testing. But my own view is very similar to the challenge that was made to the Prime Minister of Italy when people said, why didn't you close Italy down faster? And he said, a fortnight before we did it, I would have been considered to be a madman and nobody would have agreed to do it if I'd tried to move too quickly. And I think that's something that we need to reflect on here in the UK. We may have seen the signals elsewhere across the world and taken them more seriously at the time. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but as someone who's had his life in the opposite political party to the present government, I think that with some hiccups and mistakes, they've not done a bad job in what has been incredibly difficult circumstances.
And you're absolutely right. In a liberal democracy that we live in, it's very difficult for people to swallow orders given to them from government.
Well, the UK and the US, and to some extent the Scandinavian countries, have a very different history and therefore interest in maintaining the freedom to decide and the persuasion and consent that's required. Those countries that have experienced one way or another totalitarianism over the last century have a slightly different way of coming at this. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think that that's why getting the balance right of getting people to go along with what you want them to do in their interests as well as the nation as a whole is a sensible, proportional balance. And I think we now need to adjust to the coming out of the crisis gradually, readjusting to recovery in the same way.
Now, something you've mentioned recently on this balance is the police overreach in the enforcement of the COVID-19 structures that have been put in place. What have they done right, and where have they gone too far?
Well, I think that they were interpreting what was not necessarily as clear advice as it might have been for all kinds of reasons, because people were feeling their way. I think what's come out of it has been a a demonstration by local police services in some parts of the country that they could get people to do what was needed without the heavy hand of drones overhead or people being told that they shouldn't be walking in the street, because this was all about self-isolation, not incarceration. It was about getting people not to pass the infection on to each other and therefore to provide distance rather than to make our lives a misery. Those police services that adopted that policing by consent and chivying people along did really well. Those who went over the top, I think, soon got a very substantial pushback. And one of the strengths of our democracy is that you could have that debate. People could say, I'm terribly sorry, we think the police force in our area has gone over the top. And that in itself is a constraint and a readjustment. That's another strength of living in a country where you can have opinions and express them without actually being thought to be a fool.
Now, of course, the government has faced criticism that they were slow to react, and Boris Johnson wasn't present at the early COVID-19 COBRA meetings. Now, Number 10 has claimed that this is normal practice. The health secretary often chairs COBRA meetings related to health. Does this tally with your experience as a Secretary of State, or would you have expected the PM to be more hands-on during the initial stages?
I think different prime ministers do have a very different style. And Boris's style, which I think will now be considerably adjusted, was very swashbuckling. In some senses, delegating is a good thing, as every leader of every business or public service knows. Those who try to pull too much into themselves end up with a massive bottleneck, great failure of trust, and the inability of people to show what they're worth and to demonstrate their capability. So I'd be very wary of jumping in and saying he was wrong to delegate the essential COBRA meetings. What I was surprised about was that he didn't chair the first couple, because my experience with Tony Blair for the 8 years I was in cabinet was that Tony was a great delegator, but he would get a grip to begin with, watch what the difficulties were, and then give people direction and confidence to be able to get on with it. So looking back, I think Boris himself probably thinks, God, I wish I'd spotted the signals from elsewhere in the world more rapidly, and I'd just been there. However, this also raises another issue. All of us in positions of leadership need good teams around us. I think after this is over, he will be assessing those who really did step up and those who demonstrated their inadequacy. I think we'll probably end up in a year's time with a much stronger cabinet than we have today.
Well, absolutely. And of course, we've seen a significant drop in the visibility of certain special advisors like Dominic Cummings during this entire period. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out.
It's certainly readjusted the role of those behind the scenes with those who should be taking the decisions, having received advice. Obviously, there's been a complete transformation in the profile of experts, if I might use that term, who'd previously been denigrated. Scientists, medics, people with behavioral science understanding. My only criticism was, were we getting wide enough advice? Were we narrowing it too much to a couple of key centres in London? But that's because I've always been adverse to everything being London-centric. I think there's great expertise, wisdom, experience out in the sticks, and we should use it.
Rightly so. Now, was pandemic planning part of your time as a minister, particularly perhaps when you were Home Secretary?
Well, it was, but it was on the back of risk arising out of counter-terrorism measures.
Right.
I was the Home Secretary for 3 months when the attack took place in September 2001 on the World Trade Center and beyond. We did an enormous amount of scenario planning, both desktop and real. On the back of that, it was very heavily orientated to future developing terrorism risk. I certainly got involved with talking about pandemics. I remember being at a seminar in Edinburgh, where the university there had done a lot of work itself on the issue of pandemics. And of course, we saw SARS and other things emerging. I think people have criticised the government for not picking up the report from 2015, 5 years ago. I think that what happens is human nature kicks in. You deal with what you're immediately faced with. You can sponsor reports, and this is true of business planning, of course, as well, and scenario planning for what business continuity will look like, recovery plans for business, what will happen if there's a cyber attack, what happens if there's an energy shutdown. These kind of things you can look at, but you're immediately turning your eyes to what's in front of you. And had we picked up a bit more on the danger from Ebola and SARS and what have you in the past, then we might have said, what if something hits us in the developed nations that we don't have a vaccine for, that we can't immediately whisk up protective materials or equipment, or for that matter, medicines that help with recovery, all of which we now see are a danger. I think this will make an enormous difference to the planning for the years ahead. I hope it will be widened so that we don't just look at what's happened, but very rarely do you see something exactly repeat itself. Some of the circumstances will be, but others won't. So that's why I've put emphasis in what I talk about on looking at the other virus, the cyber attack scenario, which could be just as dangerous in a world of just-in-time provision. One of the miracles of the modern developed world, except for the very poor, has been the distribution of food. A lot of it on computerized, technologically advanced systems. If that were to come down, we'd be in real trouble. So I think we need to think those sort of scenarios as well.
So have a full plan across both sectors, biological warfare, pandemics, and cyber warfare.
Yes, and to do so on different levels. I think, again, thinking global but acting local, we need a lot more to think about what would happen if something took shape that actually broke down those national and global chains and how we would cope. And without, obviously, we've got enough fear and anxiety to last a lifetime. Without creating even more anxiety, we can think about those things for the future in a more rational way, I think.
Now, aside from the physical threat of the virus, one of the things that people are vastly worried about is the effect on the economy, not just the national economy, but also the world economy. Now, it has been said by certain parties, and I'd like to garner your thoughts on this. Is there a danger of the effects of the lockdown being even worse than those of the virus?
Were it be prolonged, I fear that balance would tip the other way. It is about proportionality. It is about balance. It's the wisdom of Solomon, really, to get the moment right when you start to move and then to move quickly. There's no doubt whatsoever that we are stocking up, not just on the economic and employment front, which will be devastating enough, but on the health and social well-being front, enormous challenges. And they will need careful handling because there's a lot of people whose lives, for a variety of reasons, are at risk in the future on a scale that we've been dealing with over the immediate handling of the pandemic, concentrating really hard on those affected by COVID-19, those sadly who have died or been seriously incapacitated. That will roll over into the economic, the social, the mental health and cultural well-being of the nation, and that will need all of us to pull together as well.
Absolutely. Now, do you believe the government's doing enough for business?
I think that the speed of reaction once the scale of the pandemic was clear was very good. I've praised Rishi Sunak for his action. remember a chancellor who only just come into office was planning to deliver the budget in the middle of March and has had at least three equivalent budgets since. I think he's handled it very well. Understandably worried now about what we're doing to our economy. The level of borrowing is sustainable because of low interest rates, but it reaches a point, of course, where it tips over so that you can't then do the kind of structural investment requirements that the government were laying out before and in the March budget. And those will have their consequences as well as a planned payback over many years. I think we've learned something over the last few months. We needed to take immediate action. We don't want another round of austerity equivalent from 2010 through to 2019. I don't think the nation, on the back of what's happened and the challenges we have, could take that. And therefore, we need a different plan, economic plan, over a much longer period, just as we did from the Second World War all the way through to 2002, when the final American loans were paid off.
Now, of course, one thing that's on everyone's lips, how much longer do you believe that the lockdown can go on for?
I believe that we need to be substantially back in action as an economy in June. This obviously is led in terms of places where people would meet in large numbers, having to adjust to the fact that it will be longer for them. And sadly, that will involve business closures. It's why the Chancellor extended the furlough scheme to the end of June. Mm-hmm. But unless we get things moving in June, I think we'll run into the summer where all kinds of services and industries will have a chain reaction effect. And what happens with one will then have a major impact on another. And then you get the skittle effect where things get knocked down that you hadn't perceived were going to be affected. So I very much, if I were in government, and I always think of things in that context, what would I do if I were in government? I would be on the side from the second week in May, on the side of the hawks in terms of saying we've got to start moving, and we've got to do so with the collaboration and cooperation of the public who have got the message, who did behave, who responded magnificently. Let's try and get back, perhaps, doing things differently for a time, but substantially getting back to business as usual. And unless we do that, then those areas that can't and wouldn't expect to be back in action immediately get pushed further into the middle of the year and the autumn, and then they become unsustainable.
Now, of course, one of the other major developments we've had recently are the changes in the Labour Party. So if we could just speak on the Labour Party for a while. This might sound like an obvious question, but how does Sir Keir differ from Mr. Corbyn?
Well, I'm biased because I believe the Labour Party has come out of 4.5 years of a black hole of a nightmare, where it neither represented a credible opposition nor an electable government. And the combination was to let those who supported the Labour Party and needed some of its policies let them down very badly. Sir Keir Starmer both is a highly intelligent, professional lawyer who, as Director of Public Prosecutions, led the service well, had to take difficult decisions at a time of austerity, understands the world beyond Labour members, but has been able to do business with those who originally supported Jeremy Corbyn and was able to command support from them. His creation of a balanced shadow ministerial team has been very encouraging. I supported Lisa Nandy, who he's made shadow foreign secretary, because I thought she understood the north of England and the disaffected former Labour voters. But I believe that Sir Keir has taken on board those who have something really sensible to offer. And I believe he will be both a great leader of the opposition. More importantly, he will then present himself as a credible alternative prime minister. And all governments need an alternative government at their shoulder. It was true of us from 97, and it took the Conservatives some time to recover and to get to that position, but they did, and the Labour Party will, and that's crucial for our democracy. All of us need to understand and appreciate that a living, breathing, functioning democracy requires a credible, confident, and in many ways supportable opposition, as well as a government that we clearly want to do well, because none of us want, as we didn't with the COVID crisis, none of us want the government to fail. We want to see our economy recover. We want our social well-being to be taken into account. We want to overcome deep-seated inequality and poverty, and we want to do it with enterprise and entrepreneurship and business playing their role, and that is about leadership nationally, locally, in the private and the public sector, people with ideas, with confidence, with the ability to pull teams around them, above all, to have some idea of what it is they want to achieve and a very good idea as to how to achieve it.
Now, of course, one of the biggest problems Sakir is facing will be tackling the party's anti-Semitism problem. There has been a recent internal report that has been quite damning. What's your response to that report, and what does Sakir need to do in response?
Well, there are two reports. One which is being produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which he will, and has already indicated, will implement in full. The second was a leaked report put together by the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, 800 pages of private interchanges on social media, which he has, Keir Starmer, set up an investigation to identify who did it, who leaked it, what the content was, does it have any salience and lessons for us, and where necessary, action will be taken. So I hope that as he moved very quickly to reassure the Jewish community, so he will be able to take the necessary steps to back up that reassurance with the kind of actions that says that this was a blight on a historic, great political party that all of us were ashamed of. We've been able to put that behind us and to move on to facing the future with confidence.
What's the one key thing that Sakir needs to do to restore Labour as an election-winning party?
I think Sir Keir Starmer's major challenge is to convince sceptical voters that Labour has not only reverted to a party that they can support because they can see it acting, developing, presenting as a credible alternative government, but also that the lessons have been learned from the fiasco from 2015 onwards. In other words, there have to be very clear signals of substantial change, not just the right words, not just reassurance that we're not going back to some of the crazier policies, but actually that we've understood why the electorate rejected those policies so substantially in December 2019. If people get that message, they'll understand that the Labour Party has changed, as it did in the 1980s and early 90s, to become the electable government with the greatest majority in historic majority, even greater than 1945, which I was privileged to be able to take advantage of in 1997 when I joined the cabinet.
Now, I know what your answer is going to be to this question, but indulge me. Do you think Sakir has what it takes to be PM?
Yes, I do. I think he has the background, he has the experience, he has the professionalism, he has the forensic mindset, and he has the confidence to have put a team around him which will ensure that it will work. And those elements are true of all leaders ideas, the ability to build a team, to have confidence in that team, and to be able to demonstrate leadership in practice, sometimes at the most difficult times. And, the Leaders' Council, those sharing their thoughts with the kind of thing that we're doing now with a podcast, but also joining us in linking up in that network of people who can support and help each other and learn from each other. That is what needs to be done in politics as it needs to be done in business. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew.
Well, thank you for coming on the program. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all those listening in what has been a nightmare scenario. Good luck for the future. Have courage, have confidence, and yes, listen to those who know more about business than I ever will.
Thank you, Lord Blunkett.
Thank you.
This has been the Leaders' Council podcast. Thank you for celebrating excellence in leadership with us. I have been your host, Matthew O'Neill. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast. The views expressed within the podcast do not reflect the views of the Leaders' Council of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, its parent company or subsidiaries, members of staff, other guests, or any other person therein associated.